You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Long thought to be the stuff of textbook and historical documentaries, public school segregation is still a growing problem around the country, as well as here in Minnesota. Reporter A.J. Holler is here to share his recent conversation on the subject with noted expert Myron Orfield.
Thanks, Jim. I recently spoke with Professor Orfield of the University of Minnesota's Law School. He's also head of the university's Institute on Race and Poverty and a former state senator. We discussed both the causes of this new wave of segregation and the effects that it has on the individual and society as a whole. He says that many of the efforts to desegregate schools that you saw in the 60s and 70s have fallen by the wayside, and efforts to reverse this trend are proving difficult.
School segregation was thought to have been eliminated a long time ago. Both the civil rights movement and the Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Board of Education were thought to have ended the separation of whites and non-whites in the classroom. But according to University of Minnesota law professor Myron Orfield, schools in Minnesota are now more segregated than ever. How did we get to this point? As Orfield states, when desegregation was a priority, policy brought about diversity.
We made a strong effort in the country between 1965 and roughly 1980 to reduce segregation, and we did. The country got dramatically more integrated from every year from 1965 until the early 80s. It was courts, it was legislators, it was policymakers that cared about it, pushing the edge of the envelope. The country stayed integrated from 1980 till the early 90s. We kept the progress we'd made. It wasn't an integrated society, but it was much less segregated than it had been. And then in the early 90s, the courts dismantled their efforts to achieve integration, and legislators dismantled their efforts little by little and faster and faster. And so beginning in the early 90s, the country started to resegregate, and now it's more segregated than it's ever been in our schools. And this Minneapolis is an example. In 1995, there were about 5 or 6 segregated schools, maybe as many as 9. Now there's 110 segregated schools. And this is many more than we've ever had before. And so we stopped trying, and we stopped allowing people to try.
Many may dismiss segregation today as a small racial issue in post-racial America, but its effects cause major social problems.
Segregation by race, which is shaped by housing discrimination, the drawing of school boundaries, the placement of affordable housing. Segregation by race concentrates poverty, so that 3/4 of poor Black and Latino kids go to overwhelmingly poor schools. 3/4 of white poor children go to middle-income schools. Segregation by race concentrates poverty. Concentrated poverty multiplies the disadvantage of being poor. So poor kids start behind. When poor kids go to poor schools, they get much further behind. Dropout rates increase, access to college and higher education decline. Poor African American kids who grow up often in segregated neighborhoods as well as segregated schools feel less comfortable navigating a multiracial society. Whites who grow up in isolated circumstances feel much less comfortable around African American kids. So both segregation hurts everybody.
According to Orfield, school segregation today continues to exist because the most vocal are the people who see diversity as the problem.
One of the reasons that schools are resegregating is that public officials at all levels of government feel that people don't want integrated schools. They have a very strong feeling from some whites that they don't want to be in integrated schools. They also have the feeling from some vocal parts of the minority community, the Black and Latino families, the non-white community, pretty soon we'll have to say that they don't want it. It's important for people that do value it to express that to local elected officials and to local decision makers that it's a value. And there's not as much of that as there used to be. There's not as many advocates that stand up and say this is a value, or individuals.
For Access Minnesota, I'm A.J. Holler.
A.J., were you surprised that school segregation is worse in Minnesota today than it was more than 40 years ago?
Yes, I was surprised. You think of the civil rights movement as something that kind of opened doors for a lot of people, but I did attend a suburban high school, and thinking about it now, there were very few students of color or any minorities, so it shouldn't have been surprising.
A.J., wasn't busing supposed to address the segregation issue?
Well, busing was supposed to address the issue, and for a while it did decent job at it. However, there was a lot of financial constraints by busing, and it was never really popular to begin with. So when local municipalities started cutting costs and they looked, oh, this busing program, no one's really enjoying it, or at least the people who were enjoying it weren't as vocal as the critics.
A.J. Holler, thanks for that report. That's all for this edition of Access Minnesota. Coming up in our March So, a report on smart grid technology and its potential to improve our nation's electrical power systems. Also a look at a University of Minnesota study that suggests that state-funded public education may soon become a thing of the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next month.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.